The roar of the crowd was a living thing, a creature of bloodlust and anticipation that shook the very stones of the pit arena, and Greshka knew they wanted her dead. She stood in the center of the sand-covered floor, her green skin slick with sweat and blood-some hers, most belonging to the fallen gladiator at her feet. The human crowd screamed for her execution, for one more kill to satisfy their hunger for violence, but all she felt was the bone-deep exhaustion that came from 3 years of fighting for their entertainment. Finish him. Someone shrieked from the stands, and a chorus of voices joined in, a chant that echoed off the wooden walls of the fighting pit. Finish him! Finish him! Greshka stood over the man, a seasoned fighter who had underestimated her speed. Her chest heaved with each breath, and she tightened her grip on the dulled blade they allowed her to use. The weapon was designed to maim rather than kill quickly, to prolong the suffering for the crowd's pleasure. She hated it. She hated all of this. The man at her feet groaned, clutching his side where she had struck him. He was done, defeated, no longer a threat. By the laws of the pit, she could kill him now and claim victory, or she could spare him and risk the wrath of the crowd and her owner. Kill him, orc filth. A voice rose above the others, and something wet and rotten hit her shoulder. Spoiled fruit. The crowd was getting restless. Greshka looked up at the stands, at the sea of faces twisted with hatred and excitement. 3 years. 3 years since raiders had sold her to this place after destroying her clan's settlement. 3 years of fighting, of surviving, of becoming the monster they already believed her to be. She lowered her blade. The crowd's roar turned angry, confused. They did not understand mercy, especially not from an orc. Greshka stepped back from the fallen fighter, and guards rushed onto the sand to drag him away. Her owner, a bloated merchant named Corvus, would be furious. She would pay for this defiance later, in the dark cells beneath the arena where no crowds watched. But as she turned to leave the pit, her eyes caught on a single figure in the stands. A man, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of sun and hard work. He was not screaming like the others. He was simply watching her, his expression unreadable, his hands gripping the wooden railing in front of him with white knuckles. Then the guards surrounded her, and she was pulled back into the shadows beneath the arena. The cell was cold stone and iron bars, a cage barely large enough for her to stretch out in. Greshka sat against the back wall, her knees drawn up, examining the new cuts on her arms. None were deep enough to worry about, though infection was always a concern in this filthy place. She had survived worse. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, and she tensed. It was too early for her evening meal, such as it was. That meant either punishment or another fight, but the figure that appeared at her cell was neither a guard nor Corvus. It was the man from the stands, the one who had been watching her with that strange intensity. Up close, she could see he was tall and lean, dressed in simple but well-made clothes that marked him as neither wealthy nor poor. A farmer, perhaps, or a tradesman from one of the outlying villages. "You are the orc fighter," he said, his voice low and steady. Greshka did not respond. She had learned long ago that conversation with the arena's patrons led nowhere good. The man seemed unbothered by her silence. He studied her through the bars, his brown eyes moving across her face, her tusks, her scarred arms. "Why did you spare that man today? What does it matter to you?" The words came out harsher than she intended, roughened by thirst and exhaustion. "It matters because I am trying to understand something." He moved closer to the bars, close enough that she could see the calluses on his hands, the kind that came from working land or handling tools. Everyone else in that crowd wanted blood. They wanted to see you kill, but you chose differently. And now I will be punished for it. Greshka shrugged, affecting an indifference she did not quite feel. The crowd pays for death. I gave them disappointment instead. The crowd is made of fools. The man spoke the words flatly, as if stating a simple fact. I am called Preston Price. I came to this town 3 days ago on business, and I made the mistake of accepting an invitation to the arena. I have regretted it every moment since. Greshka finally looked at him properly, searching his face for deception or mockery. She found neither. Then why are you here now, Preston Price? Because I want to buy you. The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. Greshka laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the stone walls. I am not for sale to anyone but the wealthiest lords and merchants, and even they cannot afford Corvus's asking price. I am his most profitable fighter. Everything has a price. Preston's jaw set in a determined line. And I have gold enough, I think. I sold my father's land before I came here, all 200 acres. I have been traveling, looking for a new place to settle, somewhere far from the memories of the war. But today, watching you in that pit, I thought perhaps gold could serve a better purpose. You would spend your fortune on an orc slave. Greshka could not keep the disbelief from her voice. Why? So you can have your own pit fighter, your own monster to show off. Preston's expression hardened. I would spend it to buy a person's freedom. What you do with that freedom is your own choice. Before Greshka could respond, before she could process what he was saying, heavy footsteps announced the arrival of guards. Preston stepped back from the cell, and 2 large men appeared, along with Corvus himself, his jowls quivering with rage. You dare speak to my property without permission. Corvus spat the words at Preston. Guards, remove this man from my arena. I wish to make a purchase. Preston did not move, did not show fear. I wish to buy the orc fighter. Corvus's eyes narrowed with greed and suspicion. She is not for sale. Everything is for sale, Preston echoed his earlier words, and I have gold. 200 acres worth. What is your price? The negotiation that followed was brutal and lengthy. Greshka sat in her cell, listening as Preston Price bargained for her life with the same calm determination he might use to buy a horse or a plow. Corvus named an outrageous sum, expecting Preston to balk. Preston countered with an offer only slightly lower. They argued over her worth as if she were meat, as if she could not hear every word. In the end, Preston paid almost everything he had. Greshka watched through the bars as he counted out gold coins, his hands steady even as he traded his entire future for a scarred orc woman he did not know. Corvus took the gold with greedy hands and the cell door swung open. She is yours, the merchant said, already turning away to count his fortune. Take her and go, and if she kills you, do not come crying to me about it. Preston stood at the open doorway, waiting. Greshka stared at him, at this human man who had just purchased her freedom for reasons she could not begin to understand. Slowly, her legs shaking from disbelief and exhaustion, she stood and walked out of the cell. They did not speak as they left the arena. Preston led the way through the corridors, past the guards who sneered but did not stop them, out into the fading sunlight of late afternoon. Greshka followed, her mind struggling to accept that she was truly leaving this place, that 3 years of captivity were ending not with death, but with a stranger's inexplicable kindness. Preston had a horse waiting, a sturdy mare laden with travel packs. He offered Greshka a waterskin and she drank deeply, the clean water like salvation after years of stagnant prison rations. He offered her bread and dried meat and she ate, her hands trembling. Where are we going? She finally asked. Away from here. Preston swung up into the saddle, then offered her his hand. I have supplies for a few weeks of travel. I thought we might head north toward the frontier. There are homesteads there, land that needs working, places far from cities and their arenas. Greshka hesitated, staring at his outstretched hand. You bought me. I am your property now, the same as I was Corvus's. No, Preston's voice was firm. I bought your freedom, not you. You can come with me or you can go your own way. The choice is yours, Greshka. She startled at the sound of her name on his lips. How do you know what I am called? I asked one of the guards before I came to your cell. He kept his hand extended, patient. Well, what do you choose? Greshka looked back at the arena, at the place that had held her in chains for so long. Then she looked at Preston Price, at this strange human who had spent everything he owned to set her free. She did not understand him, did not know if she could trust him, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would die before going back into that cage. She took his hand and let him help her up behind him on the horse. They rode until the sun set, and darkness forced them to make camp. Preston found a spot off the main road, sheltered by trees and near a small stream. He moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to traveling alone, unpacking supplies, building a fire, setting up a simple camp with practiced ease. Greshka watched him, still half convinced this was some elaborate trick or dream. But the warmth of the fire was real, and the blanket Preston offered her was soft and clean, unlike anything she had touched in years. You should rest, he said, settling on the opposite side of the fire. We have a long journey ahead if you are willing to come north with me. Why did you do this? The question burst out of her, raw and demanding. No human spends their fortune on an orc. No human risks bringing one of my kind into civilized lands. What do you want from me? Preston was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. I was a soldier once in the border wars. I fought against orc clans, killed your people because I was told it was right and necessary. I did terrible things because I believed the lies I was fed about orcs being monsters, incapable of mercy or honor. He looked up at her then, meeting her eyes across the fire. But today, in that arena, I watched you spare a man's life when you could have killed him. I watched you choose mercy when the entire world was screaming for blood. And I realized that everything I had been told, everything I had believed was wrong. So I suppose I bought your freedom because I owe a debt to your people that I can never fully repay. This is just a start. Greshka absorbed his words, turned them over in her mind. She had expected lust or cruelty or some twisted need to own her. She had not expected guilt or genuine remorse. Your debt is not my burden to absolve. I do not forgive you for the orcs you killed. I would not ask you to, Preston said simply. I just want to do better than I did, and if you will allow it, I would like to help you find whatever future you want for yourself. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Greshka felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of fear and anger that had lived there since the raiders took her. She was not foolish enough to trust him completely, not yet, but she was willing to wait and see if his actions matched his words. I will come north with you, she said finally. But if you betray me, if this is some trick, I will not hesitate to defend myself. Preston nodded, accepting her terms. I would expect nothing less. That night, Greshka slept under the stars for the first time in 3 years, wrapped in a clean blanket with a full belly and no chains on her wrists. She woke several times, startled by the absence of stone walls and iron bars, but each time she opened her eyes, Preston was there across the fire, keeping watch, keeping her safe. They traveled north for 2 weeks, following roads that grew progressively rougher and less traveled. The landscape changed around them, cities and towns giving way to farming communities, and then to wild frontier country, where civilization was a scattering of homesteads separated by miles of forest and open land. Preston proved to be a quiet traveling companion, neither chattering needlessly nor maintaining oppressive silence. He shared his food freely, asked nothing of her beyond helping set up camp in the evenings, and respected the distance she kept between them. Gradually, Greshka found herself relaxing in his presence, her constant vigilance easing into something closer to calm. They passed through a small village on the 10th day, and Greshka braced herself for the reaction her presence would cause. The villagers stared, some with fear, others with open hostility. A mother pulled her child inside when they passed, slamming the door. A group of men outside the tavern muttered threats. Preston ignored them all, purchasing supplies with polite efficiency and getting them back on the road before trouble could start. But Greshka had seen the way his jaw clenched, the anger he held back on her behalf. "You will face that wherever you go with me," she said once they were clear of the village. "Humans do not accept orcs among them." "Then those humans are fools," Preston replied, "and I have little use for fools." 3 days later, they reached the edge of the frontier proper, a vast expanse of unclaimed land where the bold and desperate came to carve out new lives. Preston stopped at a land office in the last civilized town, a ramshackle collection of buildings that served as a trading post and way station for settlers. "I want to file a claim," he told the clerk, a wizened man with ink-stained fingers. 200 acres, good farmland if possible, near water." The clerk looked past Preston to where Greshka stood, and his expression soured. "You planning to bring that orc onto claimed land?" "I am planning to establish a homestead with my companion," Preston said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "Is that going to be a problem?" The clerk looked like he wanted to make it a problem, but the gold Preston laid on the counter spoke louder than prejudice. He produced maps and documents, pointing out available parcels. Preston studied them carefully, asking questions about soil quality, water sources, and proximity to other settlements. In the end, he chose a parcel that was isolated, several hours' ride from the nearest neighbor, with a stream running through it and a mix of cleared land and forest. Perfect for someone who wanted privacy and the chance to build something from nothing. The clerk processed the claim with ill grace, taking Preston's gold and handing over the deed. "You are on your own out there," he warned. "Frontier justice is the only law. If your orc causes trouble, do not expect help from town." "She is not my orc," Preston corrected, his voice cold. "And the only trouble I expect to find is from people like you." They left the trading post and rode toward their new home, following the clerk's directions into increasingly wild country. The sun was setting when they finally reached the boundaries of Preston's claim, marked by stone cairns and blazed trees. The land was beautiful in a raw, untamed way. The stream the clerk had mentioned was actually a good-sized creek, running clear and cold over smooth stones. The cleared portion was perhaps 40 acres, overgrown but workable, while the rest was forest thick with oak and pine. In the center of the cleared land stood the remnants of a previous homesteader's attempt. A partially built cabin, its walls standing but its roof incomplete, and the stone foundations of what might have been a barn. Preston dismounted and stood looking at the ruins, his expression thoughtful. "It is not much, but it is a start. With work, we could have a proper home here." Greshka slid down from the horse, her feet touching land that belonged to no arena, no master, no one but Preston Price, who had paid for it with his inheritance. She walked to the creek and knelt beside it, dipping her hands in the cold water. Behind her, she heard Preston unpacking, beginning the work of making camp in the shell of the cabin. "Why here?" she asked, turning to look at him. You could have chosen land closer to town, closer to other people. Why isolate yourself with an orc? Preston paused in his work, considering the question. Because I have had enough of people and their judgments. Because I want to build something good, something clean, and I do not need neighbors watching my every move and questioning my choices. And because I thought you might want space to heal, to figure out who you are beyond what the arena made you. Greshka felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had built to survive captivity. She turned away quickly, not wanting him to see the wetness in her eyes. I do not know who that is anymore. Then we will figure it out together, Preston said gently. No rush, we have time. They worked through the late spring and into summer, transforming the abandoned homestead into a functioning farm. Preston proved to be a skilled carpenter and farmer, able to coax crops from the earth and build with his hands. Greshka discovered that her years in the fighting pits had left her strong and capable, able to lift heavy timbers and work long hours without tiring. Together, they completed the cabin's roof, using wood from the forest and clay from the creek bank. They cleared more land, planted late crops that might yield before winter, and began work on rebuilding the barn. The work was hard and constant, but Greshka found herself welcoming the exhaustion that came from honest labor rather than violence. Preston treated her as an equal partner in all things, asking her opinion on where to plant or how to build, sharing the work and the food and the decisions. He never commanded, never demanded, never raised his voice or his hand in anger. It was so foreign to everything she had known in the arena that she sometimes did not know how to respond. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the cabin's new porch watching the sun set over their fields, Preston spoke into the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. You never talk about before, he said carefully. Before the arena. You do not have to, but I want you to know I would listen if you wanted to share. Greshka was quiet for a long moment, watching fireflies begin to dance in the twilight. She had not spoken of her clan, her family, her old life to anyone since her capture. The memories were painful, wrapped in grief and loss. But something about this place, about Preston's patient presence, made her want to share the burden. I had a family, she began, her voice rough with emotion. A mother, a father, 2 younger brothers. We were part of a small clan that lived in the borderlands, trying to make peace with the human settlements nearby. My father believed that orcs and humans could coexist if both sides would just talk instead of fight. He sounds like a wise man, Preston said softly. He was. Greshka swallowed hard. But wisdom does not stop raiders. They came in the night, mercenaries hired by some human lord who wanted our land. They burned our settlement, killed anyone who resisted. I was 19 and I fought, but there were too many of them. They took me and a few others, sold us to slavers who sold us to the arenas. Your family? Preston asked, though she could hear that he already knew the answer. Dead, all of them. The words came out flat, drained of emotion by years of repetition in her own mind. I am the last of my clan. Preston was silent, and when Greshka finally looked at him, she saw grief written across his face, genuine sorrow for losses that were not his own. I am sorry, he said. I am sorry that happened to you. I am sorry for every human who has hurt your people. You cannot apologize for your entire race, Greshka said, but there was no bitterness in it now, just tired acceptance. Perhaps not, but I can try to do better to be better. Preston turned to face her fully. You are not the last of your clan, Greshka. You are the beginning of something new if you choose to be. This land, this home, it is as much yours as mine. You are not a guest here, not a worker. You are my partner in this if you want to be. Greshka felt tears spill down her cheeks, the first she had allowed herself to cry since her capture. Preston did not try to touch her or comfort her, simply sat with her grief and let her feel it fully. When the tears finally stopped, she felt lighter somehow, as if some of the weight she had carried had been shared and made more bearable. "I want to be," she said quietly. "I want this to be home." Preston smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face into something warm and open. "Then it is. Welcome home, Greshka." Summer faded into autumn and the homestead thrived. Their late crops came in better than expected, and Preston taught Greshka how to preserve food for the winter, how to smoke meat and store root vegetables and dry herbs. They hunted together in the forest, and Greshka discovered she was a better tracker than Preston, able to move silently through the woods and read signs he missed. The work drew them closer, physically and emotionally. Greshka became accustomed to Preston's presence, to the sound of his voice and the sight of his smile. She learned his habits, the way he always rose before dawn, the careful precision with which he approached every task, the gentle humor that emerged when he was relaxed and content. For his part, Preston seemed to delight in discovering who Greshka was beyond the fighter the arena had created. He learned that she had a quick mind and a dry wit, that she loved the quiet of early morning and the sound of rain on the cabin roof, that she hummed old orc songs while she worked, melodies from a culture and family lost to her. The first snow fell in late autumn, dusting the homestead in white and driving them to spend more time inside the cabin. They had built 2 sleeping areas, one on each end of the single large room, an acknowledgement of propriety and privacy. But they spent their evenings together by the fire, Preston teaching Greshka to read from books he had brought with him, Greshka teaching Preston words in the orc tongue. It was during one of these evenings that everything changed. They were sitting close together, sharing warmth and looking at a book of poetry Preston had inherited from his mother. His shoulder pressed against hers, and Greshka was acutely aware of the contact, of the heat of his body and the smell of wood smoke and soap that clung to him. Preston was reading aloud, something about love and longing, when he stumbled over a word and looked up to find Greshka staring at him. Their eyes met, and the air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. "Greshka," Preston said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something." She could not breathe, could not move. She knew what was coming and feared it and wanted it in equal measure. "I did not buy your freedom because of guilt or debt," Preston continued, setting the book aside. "I mean, those things were part of it, but the real reason, the truth, is that when I saw you in that arena, when I watched you choose mercy over violence, I felt something I have never felt before. And these months living with you, working beside you, learning who you are, those feelings have only grown stronger." "Preston," Greshka started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I know this is complicated. I know that you are orc and I am human, and the world will not understand or accept us. I know that I have no right to feel this way after what my people have done to yours, but I cannot help it. I am falling in love with you, Greshka. I might have already fallen." The words hung in the air between them, terrifying and beautiful. Greshka felt her heart racing, felt the truth of her own feelings rising up to meet his confession. She had been pushing them down for weeks, telling herself it was impossible, that she could not love a human, that Preston was just kind and she was just grateful. But it was more than that. It had always been more than that. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid to feel this. Every time I have loved someone, they have been taken from me. My family, my clan, everything I cared about has been destroyed." Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, familiar now after months of working beside him. "I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise that I am not going anywhere. I am here, and I choose to be here with you, for as long as you will have me." Greshka looked down at their joined hands, human and orc, and made a choice that terrified and exhilarated her. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to Preston's, a gesture of trust and affection among her people. He froze for a moment, then relaxed, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling strange and right in her mouth. "I did not want to. I tried not to, but I do." Preston made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then he was kissing her, gentle and careful, asking permission with every movement. Greshka kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. They broke apart after a moment, both breathing hard, and Preston rested his forehead against hers again. "We will figure this out," he promised. "Together." "Together," Greshka agreed and kissed him again. Winter settled over the homestead in earnest, blanketing the world in snow and ice. Greshka and Preston spent the long, dark months learning each other in new ways, their relationship shifting from friendship to something deeper and more intimate. They were careful with each other, aware of their differences and the newness of what they shared, but the love between them grew stronger with each passing day. Preston proved to be an attentive and tender lover, patient with Greshka's initial uncertainty and responsive to her needs. Greshka discovered that physical intimacy could be about connection and pleasure rather than survival and pain, and she treasured every moment of closeness with Preston. They talked late into the nights, sharing dreams and fears. Preston spoke of his desire to build a lasting home, to create something good that would outlive him. Greshka talked about her wish to honor her lost family by living fully, by not letting grief and anger consume her the way they had consumed so many. "I want children someday," Preston admitted one night, his arms wrapped around Greshka as they lay together in his bed, which had become their bed. "I want a family, a legacy of love instead of violence." Greshka tensed slightly in his embrace. "Would that even be possible, between us?" "I do not know," Preston admitted, "but I would like to try if you want that too, and if it is not possible, then we will have each other, and that will be enough." Greshka turned in his arms to face him, studying his face in the firelight. "I want that," she said softly. "I want a family with you. I want to build something that lasts." Preston kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then we will." Spring came with a rush of melting snow and budding trees, and with it came the first real test of their relationship. A rider appeared at the homestead one morning, a young man from the trading post town with a message from the land office. Preston had paid for only 1 year's claim, and renewal was due. Preston read the notice, his expression growing dark. "The price has tripled," he said. "They are trying to force us out." Greshka felt cold fear settle in her stomach. "Because of me, because you have an orc on your land." "Yes," Preston admitted, not bothering to lie. "The clerk made that quite clear when I filed the claim. They do not want us here." "Then leave me and pay the normal price," Greshka said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I can go find my own way. You do not have to give up your home for me." Preston's eyes flashed with anger, and he crossed to her in 2 quick strides, taking her hands in his. "This is our home, not just mine, and I am not giving it up, and I am certainly not giving you up. We will find another way." "What other way? We do not have that kind of gold." Preston's expression turned thoughtful. "No, but we have something else. We have a good farm, productive land, and skills that are valuable. I can hire out as a carpenter to other homesteaders. You can hunt and sell the meat and furs. We can make this work." They spent the spring and early summer working harder than ever before. Preston took commissions from other settlers, traveling to help build barns and homes and fences. Greshka hunted in the forest, bringing down deer and wild boar that she butchered and sold in town. It meant facing the prejudice and hostility of the townspeople, meant enduring hateful words and suspicious glares, but she did it for Preston, for their home, for the future they were building together. The gold came in slowly, but it came. By midsummer, they had enough to renew the claim, though it took nearly every coin they had earned. Preston paid the inflated price with barely controlled anger, and the clerk accepted it with a sneer. "You are just delaying the inevitable," the clerk said. "No one wants orcs on the frontier. Sooner or later, your neighbors will make that clear." Preston leaned across the counter, his voice low and dangerous. "My neighbors would do well to remember that frontier justice cuts both ways. Greshka and I have as much right to that land as anyone, and we will defend it if necessary." They rode back to the homestead in tense silence, both aware that the clerk's words carried a threat they could not ignore. Sure enough, trouble came a week later in the form of 3 men on horseback, armed and looking for a fight. Greshka was working in the garden when they rode up, and she straightened slowly, her hand moving to the knife she kept at her belt. Preston emerged from the barn, his expression wary. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone polite but cool. The leader of the group, a thick-built man with a scar across his jaw, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "We are here on behalf of the Settlers Committee. We have had complaints about an orc living on claimed land. We are here to escort it off the property." "Her name is Greshka," Preston said, his voice hardening. "And she is not going anywhere. This is her home as much as mine." "You are harboring a dangerous creature," another of the men said. "Orcs do not belong among civilized folk. Send it away or we will remove it by force." Preston stepped forward, putting himself between the men and Greshka. "I would like to see you try. This is my land, legally claimed and paid for. You have no authority here." The scarred man's hand moved to the gun at his hip. "We have the authority of decent people who do not want monsters as neighbors." "Then you should leave," Greshka said, stepping up beside Preston. "Because the only monsters I see here are the ones who ride onto someone else's property making threats." The tension ratcheted higher, and for a moment, Greshka thought it would come to violence. She was prepared for it, her body remembering every lesson the arena had taught her. But Preston's hand found hers, squeezing gently, a reminder that there were other ways to handle this. "Gentlemen," Preston said, his voice calm despite the anger in his eyes, "I understand that my choice to share my home with Greshka makes some people uncomfortable. But it is my choice to make on my land, and it harms no one. Greshka has done nothing to any of you or your families. She works hard, keeps to herself, and asks only to be left in peace. Is that really so threatening?" The scarred man looked uncertain for the first time, his hand dropping away from his gun. "It is not natural," he muttered. "Human and orc living together." "Maybe not," Preston conceded. "But it is not illegal, and it is not your concern. Now, I am going to ask you politely, one more time, to leave our property. If you refuse, then we will have a problem, and I assure you, you will not like how that problem gets resolved." There was steel in Preston's voice, the echo of the soldier he had once been. The 3 men seemed to recognize it, because they exchanged glances and began backing their horses away. "This is not over," the scarred man warned. "The committee will not stand for this." "The committee can take their complaints to the land office," Preston replied, "but they will stay off my property." The men rode away, and Greshka released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Preston turned to her, his expression pained. "I am sorry. I should have known it would not be easy. You have nothing to apologize for." Greshka cupped his face in her hands. "You stood up for me, for us. That is more than anyone has ever done." "I will always stand up for us," Preston promised. always. But the confrontation left them both shaken, aware of how precarious their position was. They were isolated on the frontier, and while Preston had legal claim to the land, there was little real law to protect them if the settlers decided to take action. They prepared as best they could, Preston teaching Greshka how to shoot his rifle, both of them keeping weapons close at hand. But weeks passed without further incident, and gradually they relaxed back into the rhythms of their life together. Summer faded into autumn again, marking a full year since they had arrived at the homestead. The farm had thrived under their care, yielding enough crops to see them through the winter with surplus to sell. They had expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a proper loft. They had built a sturdy barn and filled it with livestock purchased with their earnings. They had made a real home together. On the anniversary of their arrival, Preston surprised Greshka with a gift. It was a necklace, simple but beautiful, made of polished wood and carved with both orc and human symbols of home and family. "I made it myself," he said, looking almost shy as he fastened it around her neck. "I wanted you to have something that honored both parts of who we are." Greshka touched the necklace, her eyes stinging with tears. "It is beautiful, thank you." "There is something else," Preston said, and he dropped to one knee in front of her. "Greshka, I know we cannot have a traditional marriage, not one that the law or any church would recognize. But I do not care about their recognition. I care about you, about us, about the life we are building together. So I am asking you, in the sight of this land and this home and whatever gods might be listening, will you be my wife? Will you bind your life to mine, for as long as we both live?" Greshka could not speak past the lump in her throat, could only nod frantically as tears spilled down her cheeks. Preston stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "We will make our own vows," he said into her hair. "Our own promises. We do not need anyone else's approval." That night, under a sky brilliant with stars, they spoke their vows to each other. Preston promised to love and protect Greshka, to stand beside her against any threat, to honor her and her lost family by building a life worth living. Greshka promised to love and trust Preston, to be his partner in all things, to create with him a home that would stand as testament to the possibility of peace between their peoples. They had no officiant, no witnesses but the trees and the stars. But their promises felt more real, more binding than any ceremony conducted by strangers who would never accept their union. They were married in the ways that mattered, committed to each other and the future they would build together. Winter came again, their second on the homestead, and with it came unexpected joy. Greshka woke one morning feeling ill, and the sickness persisted for days. At first she feared some disease, but Preston recognized the symptoms before she did. "I think you might be with child," he said gently, his hand on her stomach. Greshka stared at him in shock. "That is not possible. Orcs and humans cannot." "Apparently we can," Preston said, and his smile was brilliant with joy and wonder. "Unless you have another explanation for why you are sick every morning and why your scent has changed." Greshka put her own hand over her stomach, trying to feel any difference, any sign of the life that might be growing inside her. "I am afraid," she whispered. "What if something goes wrong? What if the child is not accepted by humans or orcs? What if we cannot protect it from the hate?" Preston pulled her into his arms, his hand cradling the back of her head. "Then we will love it enough to make up for the hate. And we will raise it to be strong and kind and proud of both its heritages. Our child will know it is wanted and cherished, no matter what anyone else thinks." The pregnancy progressed through the winter, and Greshka's body changed in ways both frightening and miraculous. Preston was attentive and protective, taking on more of the heavy work and making sure she had everything she needed. He read every book he had on childbirth and healing, preparing as best he could for when their baby arrived. Greshka's fear gradually gave way to excitement and hope. She imagined a child with her strength and Preston's kindness, a bridge between two worlds. She imagined teaching it about her lost family, about the orc traditions she remembered, while Preston taught it to read and farm and build. She imagined a future where their child would not have to choose between being orc or human but could be proudly both. Spring came, and with it came labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Greshka was certain she would not survive it. But Preston stayed beside her, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement and love. And finally, as dawn broke over the homestead, their child entered the world with a lusty cry. A son. They had a son. He was perfect, small and wrinkled and screaming his displeasure at being born. He had Preston's dark hair and Greshka's green-tinted skin, his ears slightly pointed but not fully orc. His hands were tiny and perfect, already grasping at anything they could reach. Preston cried as he held his son for the first time, tears of joy streaming down his face. "He is beautiful," he said. "He is perfect. What should we name him?" Greshka, exhausted but happier than she had ever been, smiled. In orc tradition, a child is named for the first thing the mother sees after the birth. "I see the dawn, the sun rising over our home. So I would name him Derek, which means new light." "Derek," Preston repeated, testing the name. "Derek Price. I love it. Welcome to the world, my son." They spent the first weeks learning to be parents, fumbling through feedings and changings and sleepless nights. Derek proved to be a healthy, hungry baby with strong lungs and an iron grip. He thrived despite their inexperience, growing stronger each day. Greshka had never known love like this, had never imagined she could feel so protective, so fierce, so tender all at once. Every time she looked at her son, she saw hope incarnate, living proof that peace and love could exist between orc and human. But the world beyond their homestead did not share their joy. News of the half-orc child spread through the frontier settlements, and the reactions ranged from disgust to horror to anger. The settlers' committee sent another delegation, this time demanding that the child be given up to authorities who could decide its fate. Preston met them at the property line, his rifle in hand and his expression thunderous. "You are not taking my son," he said flatly. "Not now, not ever. Leave our land immediately." "That thing is an abomination," the committee's leader, a gray-haired woman named Constance, said. "It should not exist. You have committed an unnatural act, Preston Price, and you will answer for it." "The only thing unnatural here is your hatred," Preston shot back. "My son is innocent, and he will grow up knowing love and acceptance, even if he does not find it from people like you. Now get off my property before I make you leave." The delegation left, but their threats lingered. Greshka and Preston knew they were living on borrowed time, that sooner or later the settlers would take action beyond words. They prepared as best they could, stockpiling supplies, reinforcing the cabin, making plans for where to go if they had to flee. But they were determined not to run unless absolutely necessary. This was their home, the only place Derek had ever known. They would not give it up without a fight. The attack came on a hot summer night, 2 months after Derek's birth. Greshka woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking glass. Fire, a torch thrown through the window, flames already catching on the cabin's wooden floor. Preston was up in an instant, grabbing Derek from his cradle while Greshka seized the bucket they kept for emergencies. But more torches came through the windows, and the fire spread too fast to fight. Outside, she could hear voices, men shouting, the sound of horses. "We have to go," Preston said, his face grim in the firelight. "Now, out the back." They ran, Greshka carrying their few precious belongings and Preston cradling Dirk against his chest. Behind them, the cabin they had built together burned, flames reaching toward the night sky. They made it to the forest as the barn caught fire too, their livestock screaming in terror. Preston handed Dirk to Greshka and turned back, his expression anguished. "I have to let the animals out. They will burn." "Preston, no." Greshka grabbed his arm. "It is too dangerous." "I cannot let them die," Preston said, and he was already running back toward the barn. Greshka stood frozen with Dirk in her arms, watching in horror as Preston disappeared into the burning barn. Seconds stretched into eternity, smoke billowing thick and black into the night. Then Preston emerged, coughing and staggering, the livestock streaming out behind him into the safety of the pasture. He made it 3 steps before he collapsed. Greshka screamed, torn between protecting their son and helping Preston. A figure emerged from the shadows, the scarred man from the settlers' committee, his face twisted with hate. He raised a gun, pointing it at Preston's fallen form. Greshka did not think. She set Dirk down in the shelter of a tree and charged, her body moving with all the speed and strength the arena had taught her. She hit the scarred man like a battering ram, knocking the gun from his hand. They went down in a tangle of limbs, and Greshka fought with a mother's fury, with 3 years of arena training, with desperate love for her family. She won. The scarred man lay unconscious in the dirt, and Greshka staggered to Preston's side. He was breathing but barely conscious, his skin hot to the touch. Smoke inhalation burns. She could not tell the full extent of his injuries in the darkness. Behind them, the homestead burned. Everything they had built was being consumed by flames and hate. But Greshka had her son, and she had Preston, and that was all that mattered. She got Preston onto their remaining horse, settled Dirk in her arms, and fled into the forest. They rode through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the destroyed homestead. Preston drifted in and out of consciousness, and Dirk cried from hunger and fear. Greshka held them both and kept going, driven by pure determination to keep her family alive. As dawn broke, she found a cave by a stream, deep enough to provide shelter and hidden enough to be safe. She got Preston off the horse and examined his injuries. Burns on his hands and arms, smoke damage to his lungs, but nothing that looked fatal if she could keep infection away and give him time to heal. She made a cold camp, not daring to light a fire that might give away their position. She nursed Dirk, soothed his cries, and then turned her attention to Preston. She cleaned his burns with water from the stream, tore strips from her clothing to bandage his hands, and sat beside him, willing him to survive. Preston woke as the sun climbed higher, his eyes finding hers immediately. "Dirk," he croaked, "safe, he is safe." Greshka showed him their son, sleeping peacefully now that he had been fed. "You saved the animals." "Could not let them burn," Preston murmured. "Is the homestead gone? They burned it all." Greshka felt tears threaten but pushed them back. "I am sorry, Preston. I am so sorry. This is my fault. They did this because of me." Preston's burned hand found hers, his grip weak but determined. "Not your fault. Their hate. Their choice. We will rebuild." "How? They will not let us stay. They have made that clear." "Then we go somewhere else." Preston's eyes began to drift closed again, exhaustion and pain pulling him under. "Somewhere far from towns and settlers. We find new land, unclaimed land, and we start again. The 3 of us, our family." Greshka held his hand and watched him sleep, and she made a decision. They would survive this. They would protect their son, and they would build a new home, somewhere far from the hatred of people who could not see past old prejudices. They stayed in the cave for 2 weeks while Preston healed. Greshka hunted for food and kept watch, always alert for pursuit. But no one came, and gradually Preston's strength returned. The burns on his hands healed to shiny scars, and his breathing cleared. When Preston could finally ride again, they continued north, deeper into the frontier, beyond the settled lands into territory that appeared on no maps. They traveled for weeks, moving slowly with an infant, following rivers and game trails into increasingly wild country. They found it at the end of summer, a valley so remote and isolated that Greshka doubted any other human or orc had ever set foot there. It was beautiful, with a clear lake fed by waterfalls, surrounded by forest and meadows. The climate was mild, protected by the mountains around it, and game was plentiful. "This is it," Preston said, standing at the valley's edge and looking out over the pristine wilderness. "This is where we build our new home. No neighbors, no land claims, no one to judge us or threaten our family. Just us and the land." Greshka stood beside him, Derek strapped to her back in a carrier Preston had fashioned. She looked at the valley, and she felt something settle in her chest, something like peace. "Yes," she agreed. "This is home." They built through the autumn, working faster than before because winter was coming and they had no shelter. Preston's carpentry skills and Greshka's strength combined to raise a small but sturdy cabin before the first snow fell. It was not as large or comfortable as their first home had been, but it was theirs, built with their own hands on land no one could take from them. Winter in the valley was gentler than on the frontier, and they survived it with relative ease. Derek grew and thrived, beginning to babble and laugh, showing signs of his father's curiosity and his mother's determination. Preston and Greshka watched their son with wonder and joy, marveling at the miracle of him. Spring came again, and they planted crops in the rich valley soil. They built a larger cabin to replace the first rough structure, added a barn and a smokehouse, and all the structures a homestead needed. They discovered hot springs on the far side of the lake, and spent evenings soaking in the warm water, washing away the day's work and talking about their dreams for the future. "I want more children," Greshka said one evening, floating in the springs with her head resting on Preston's shoulder. "I want Derek to have siblings, to never be alone." "As many as you want," Preston agreed, his arms around her waist. "We will fill this valley with children and love," and they did. Over the next years, Greshka bore 3 more children. 2 daughters they named Zara and Zelda, and another son they called Marcus. Each child was unique, showing different combinations of their parents' traits, but all were healthy and happy and loved beyond measure. The valley became their sanctuary, a place where their children could grow up without fear or prejudice, where orc and human blood mixed freely and created something new and beautiful. Preston taught them to raid and write and farm. Greshka taught them to hunt and track and survive in the wilderness. Together, they taught them about both their heritages, about the orc clans and human kingdoms, about history and hope and the possibility of change. Years passed, measured in harvests and birthdays and the slow expansion of their homestead. Preston's hair went gray at the temples, and Greshka's tusks grew more prominent with age. Their children grew strong and capable, each finding their own path while remaining close to the family. Derek, their firstborn, became a skilled craftsman like his father, able to build anything he could imagine. Zara inherited her mother's tracking abilities and her father's gentle nature, spending long hours in the forest studying the animals and plants. Zelda was fierce and protective, always ready to defend her siblings, with her mother's fighting instincts and her father's strategic mind. Marcus, the youngest, had a gift for growing things, and under his care their gardens produced abundantly. The children asked questions, of course, about the world beyond the valley. Preston and Greshka were honest with them, explaining the prejudice and hatred that existed, the reason they lived in isolation. But they also taught their children that the hate of others did not define their worth, that they were valuable and loved exactly as they were. "Someday," Derek said when he was 15, "I want to see the world beyond this valley. I want to show people that orcs and humans can live together, that families like ours can exist." Preston looked at his son, so brave and idealistic, and felt his heart swell with pride and fear. "That is a dangerous dream," he said carefully. "The world is not ready for that message." "Maybe not," Derek agreed. "But someone has to start changing minds. Someone has to be first." Greshka exchanged a glance with Preston over their son's head, and she saw her own conflicted emotions reflected in his eyes. They had tried to shelter their children from the ugliness of the world, but perhaps that had been a mistake. Perhaps the next generation needed to be equipped to face that ugliness and challenge it. "If that is your path," Greshka said slowly, "then we will prepare you for it. We will teach you everything we know about both worlds, about how to navigate prejudice and hate, about how to stay safe while advocating for change. But you must promise us something." "Anything," Derek said eagerly. "Promise that you will never forget you are loved, no matter what the world says about you. Promise that you will always have a home here, a place to return to when the fight becomes too hard. And promise that you will protect your siblings if they choose to join you." Derek hugged his mother and then his father, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise. All of it. I promise." It was 3 more years before Derek left the valley, accompanied by Zara, who refused to let her older brother go alone. Preston and Greshka watched them ride away, their hearts breaking and soaring at the same time. Zelda and Marcus stayed, not yet ready to leave the valley's safety, and the homestead felt emptier without their 2 oldest children. But letters came back, carried by traders and travelers who passed through the frontier towns. Derek and Zara were being careful, they wrote, revealing their mixed heritage only to those who seemed open-minded. They were finding small pockets of acceptance, meeting other families who had crossed racial lines, building networks of allies who believed in a different future. Progress was slow and dangerous, the letters admitted. There were setbacks, confrontations, times when they had to flee to avoid violence. But there were also victories, small but significant. A town that allowed Derek to work as a carpenter despite his orc heritage. A family who invited Zara to teach their children about wilderness survival. A young couple, human and orc, who sought their advice on building a life together. Preston and Greshka read the letters aloud to Zelda and Marcus, and they felt hope stirring. Their children were changing the world, one mind at a time, proving that families like theirs could exist and thrive. Years continued to pass. Zelda eventually left the valley as well, determined to become a healer and bring medical knowledge to frontier communities that lacked it. Marcus stayed, taking over more of the homestead's operations as Preston's body aged and slowed. Preston and Greshka grew old together in their hidden valley, their hands worn with work and their faces lined with years of sun and laughter. But their love remained strong, deepened by decades of partnership and shared dreams. On their 30th anniversary of arriving at the valley, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, now expanded and improved many times over, and watched the sun set over the lake. Their grandchildren, brought by Derek and Zara for a visit, played in the meadow below, their mixed heritage visible in their varied appearances but their joy universal. "We did it," Greshka said softly, her hand in Preston's. "We built something good, something that will last." Preston squeezed her hand, his eyes on the children playing. "We did more than that. We proved it was possible. We created a family that should not exist according to the world's rules, and we raised children who are changing those rules. Do you ever regret it? Greshka asked. Giving up everything to buy a scarred orc fighter from an arena. Preston turned to look at her, his eyes soft with love. Not for a single moment. That was the best decision I ever made. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Greshka leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and watched the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I was so afraid that day when you came to my cell. I thought you wanted to own me, to use me. I never imagined you would give me freedom, love, a family, a home. I never imagined finding you, Preston admitted. Finding this. I thought I would spend my life alone trying to atone for the violence of my past. Instead, I found forgiveness, love, purpose. I found everything. They sat in comfortable silence. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Around them, the valley they had claimed and tamed hummed with life. Their children's laughter, the sound of the lake lapping at the shore, the evening songs of birds settling for the night. It was not the life either of them had imagined when Preston walked into that arena so many years ago. It was better. It was real and hard and beautiful, built on choices and sacrifices and unwavering love. The crowd had roared for her death, and one man in the stands had bought the orc pit fighter's freedom. But what came after was not the end of Greshka's story. It was the beginning of everything. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow and spread. Derek established the first official school on the frontier that accepted students of all races, teaching human and orc children side by side. Zara published books on wilderness medicine that became standard texts throughout the region. Zelda opened a healing clinic in a border town, treating humans and orcs equally and refusing to turn anyone away. Marcus remained at the Valley homestead, expanding it into a sanctuary for mixed families fleeing persecution, offering them shelter and support until they could establish their own homes. Preston and Greshka watched it all unfold, their pride in their children boundless. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had built a legacy that would outlive them by generations. When Preston's health finally began to fail in his 65th year, Greshka nursed him with the same fierce devotion she had shown since the day he freed her. Their children came home, gathering around their father's bedside in the cabin he had built with his own hands. "I am not afraid," Preston told them, his voice weak but steady. "I have lived a life beyond my wildest dreams. I have loved and been loved. I have seen my children grow strong and change the world. I am ready to rest." Greshka held his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I am not ready to let you go." Preston smiled at her, the same warm smile that had captured her heart decades ago. "You will never have to. I will always be with you, in our children, in this valley, in everything we built together. Love does not end, Greshka. It just changes form." He died peacefully that night, surrounded by his family, his hand still clasped in Greshka's. They buried him on a hill overlooking the lake, beneath a tree they had planted together on their first spring in the valley. Greshka carved his headstone herself, etching words in both human and orc script. Preston Price, beloved husband and father, who proved that love could bridge any divide. Greshka lived another 10 years after Preston's death, spending her time tending the homestead, teaching her grandchildren, and writing down the story of her life with Preston so that future generations would know the truth of what they had built. She filled pages with memories. The first time Preston kissed her, the day Derek was born, the night they fled the burning homestead, the morning they found the valley, every precious moment of their life together. When her own time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, and her children buried her beside Preston on the hill. They placed both human and orc funeral offerings on her grave, honoring both parts of her heritage, and they wept for the mother who had taught them strength and love in equal measure. But the story did not end there. The valley homestead that Marcus maintained became a way station on an underground network, helping mixed families find safety and acceptance. Derek's school grew into a full academy that attracted students from across the continent. Zara's medical texts saved countless lives and trained a generation of healers who saw past race to the person needing help. Zelda's clinic expanded into a full hospital that became a model for integrated health care. The world changed slowly, resisting at every step, but it changed. And at the root of that change was the family Preston and Greshka had built. The impossible love that had produced children who refused to accept the world as it was, and instead insisted on making it better. Decades after Greshka's death, a historian traveled to the valley to research the legendary mixed family who had started it all. Marcus, now an old man himself, showed the historian around the preserved homestead, pointing out the cabin Preston had built, the gardens Greshka had planted, the graves on the hill. They were remarkable people, the historian said, taking notes. Your parents changed the world. Marcus smiled, thinking of his parents as he had last seen them, old and weathered but still deeply in love, still holding hands, still choosing each other every day. They were not trying to change the world, he said. They were just trying to love each other and raise their family in peace. The world changed as a consequence. Tell me, the historian asked, what do you think was the secret to their success? How did they make it work when so many others failed? Marcus considered the question, looking out over the valley his parents had claimed so long ago. I think it was simple, he said finally. They chose love over fear every single time. When the world told them their love was impossible, they loved anyway. When the world tried to tear them apart, they held tighter. When the world said their family should not exist, they filled it with children and joy and hope. They did not wait for the world to accept them. They built a life worth living and invited the world to catch up. The historian wrote it all down, and Marcus knew the story would spread further, inspiring more families to take the risk, to choose love over fear, to build bridges instead of walls. That night, Marcus walked up the hill to his parents' graves, as he did every evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and he could almost imagine he heard his father's laughter, his mother's humming, the sound of his siblings playing in the meadow below. Thank you, he said aloud, to the graves and to the memories and to the legacy they had left. Thank you for being brave enough to love. Thank you for showing us it was possible. Thank you for everything. The wind rustled through the tree above the graves, and Marcus smiled. He liked to think it was his parents' way of responding, of letting him know they heard, they were proud, they were at peace. He walked back down the hill as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, back to the homestead where his own children and grandchildren waited. The valley was alive with family, with love, with hope for the future. Exactly as Preston and Greshka had dreamed it would be, and in the end, that was the true ending to their story. Not death, not separation, but continuation. Their love had created ripples that spread outward, touching lives they would never meet, changing a world they would never see fully transformed. But they had started the change, had proven it was possible, had built a foundation strong enough to support generations. The crowd had roared for her death. One man had bought her freedom, and together they had built forever.